The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Jake Morrison's weathered face as he knelt beside the most peculiar tracks he'd ever encountered in his 23 years of desert survival. These weren't ordinary footprints. They measured nearly 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, pressed deep into the hard-packed earth with a force that suggested something far heavier than any human should be. The edges were crisp despite the wind that constantly swept across this desolate stretch of the Sonoran Desert, indicating they were fresh, perhaps only hours old. Jake's calloused fingers traced the outline of what appeared to be bare feet, complete with distinct toe impressions that sent an inexplicable chill down his spine despite the 110-degree heat. Jake had been tracking the stolen cattle from the Rockingham Ranch for 3 days now, following a trail that had grown increasingly bizarre with each passing mile. What started as standard cattle rustling, a common enough crime in these lawless territories of 1887, had evolved into something that defied rational explanation. The cattle tracks were there, certainly, but interwoven with them were these massive human footprints. Appearing and disappearing like some phantom walker was accompanying the stolen herd across the wasteland. The old Apache stories flooded back to him now, tales his blood brother Running Wolf had shared around countless campfires during their youth. Stories of the mountain spirits, of beings that existed in the spaces between worlds, of women touched by ancient magic who grew to enormous size and possessed strength that could move boulders and redirect rivers. Jake had always dismissed these as campfire entertainment, colorful folklore designed to keep children close to home after dark. But staring at these impossible tracks, feeling the oppressive weight of something unseen watching him from the distant mesas, those old stories suddenly carried the weight of terrible possibility. The tracks led northwest toward the Superstition Mountains, that jagged range of peaks and canyons where even the most experienced prospectors feared to venture alone. Local Mexicans called it the Sierra de la Superstition, warning of strange lights that danced among the peaks on moonless nights and echoes that carried voices of the long dead. The Apache considered it sacred ground, a place where the physical world thinned and older powers still held sway. Jake's employer, cattle baron Thomas Whitmore, had specifically warned him against pursuing any trails that led toward those peaks. But 20 head of prime beef represented more money than Jake would see in 5 years of regular ranch work. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Jake made camp in a small arroyo that offered some protection from both the wind and prying eyes. He'd learned long ago that fires were visible for miles in this clear desert air, so he settled for cold beans and stale bread, washing it down with tepid water that tasted of leather and alkali. The silence was absolute except for the occasional cry of a hawk circling high above and the whisper of wind through the scattered Palo Verde trees. But as darkness fell and the desert temperature plummeted, Jake became aware of a new sound, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, like the heartbeat of some massive creature buried beneath the sand and stone. The sound grew stronger as the night deepened, accompanied by a low humming that seemed almost musical, though no human throat could have produced such deep, resonant tones. Jake's horse, a sturdy Mustang named Diablo who had never shown fear of mountain lions or rattlesnakes, began to tremble and pull against his tether, eyes rolling white with terror. Animals knew things that men had forgotten, Jake reflected, and Diablo's panic was more convincing than any rational argument against continuing this pursuit. But Jake Morrison was not a man easily deterred by superstition or fear. He'd survived the Apache Wars, the lawless early days of Tombstone, and 3 years of drought that had broken stronger men than him. Whatever was making those tracks, human or otherwise, had stolen cattle that represented his winter survival money. He'd face down the devil himself before he'd return empty-handed to face Thomas Whitmore's disappointment and the mocking laughter of the other ranch hands. Dawn brought no relief from the mounting strangeness. The tracks continued their steady northwest progression, but now they were accompanied by other signs that made Jake's skin crawl. Cacti had been uprooted and tossed aside like weeds, their thick trunks snapped cleanly in half by incredible force. Boulders the size of wagons had been rolled aside as if they were mere pebbles, creating a clear path through terrain that should have been impassable. Most disturbing of all were the handprints, massive impressions in the soft earth near a dried creek bed, showing fingers nearly a foot long with what appeared to be claw marks extending beyond the fingertips. The stolen cattle had clearly passed this way, But their tracks showed signs of panic now. Instead of the steady progression Jake had been following, the hoof prints scattered and reformed repeatedly, indicating the animals had been spooked badly enough to attempt escape multiple times. Whatever was driving them forward wasn't using conventional herding techniques. The absence of horse tracks among the chaos suggested no human rustlers were involved, at least not in any traditional sense. By midday, Jake reached the foothills of the superstitions, where the flat desert gave way to rocky slopes dotted with saguaro cacti that stood like silent sentinels against the blazing sky. The tracks led directly toward a narrow canyon that cut deep into the mountain's heart, its walls rising so steeply that the bottom remained in perpetual shadow even at high noon. The Apache called this place Ghost Canyon. Running Wolf had told him years ago, and warned that it was one of the thin places where spirits could cross between worlds. Jake dismounted and examined the canyon entrance carefully. The massive footprints continued straight into the shadowy depths, but there was something different about them now. They appeared to be sinking deeper into the earth with each step, as if whatever was making them was growing heavier or perhaps more solid with each passing hour. The implications of that observation sent a chill through Jake that had nothing to do with the cool air flowing from the canyon's depths. The walls of Ghost Canyon rose nearly 200 feet on either side, carved smooth by countless centuries of flash floods and wind erosion. Petroglyphs covered every available surface, ancient Apache symbols mixed with older markings that predated any known Native American presence in the region. Some of the symbols appeared to be warnings, crude drawings of massive human figures towering over normal-sized people, with radiating lines that might have represented power or perhaps divine wrath. Jake had seen similar warnings carved into rocks throughout the Southwest, always dismissed by white settlers as primitive superstition, but here in this place of shadows and whispers, they carried in weight of prophetic dread. The canyon floor was surprisingly wide, perhaps 50 feet across, with a sandy bottom that showed the tracks clearly. But as Jake led Diablo deeper into the passage, he noticed that the hoofprints of the stolen cattle had been joined by others: deer, rabbits, even the tracks of predators like mountain lions and coyotes, all heading in the same direction as if drawn by some irresistible force. The natural order of prey and predator seemed suspended here, replaced by a strange pilgrimage toward whatever waited in the canyon's heart. After an hour of careful progress through the winding passage, Jake heard it singing. Not the humming he'd detected the night before, but actual words in a language he didn't recognize, though the melody stirred something deep in his memory. The voice was unmistakably female, rich and powerful with an otherworldly quality that seemed to resonate through the stone walls themselves. Each note hung in the air far longer than should have been physically possible, creating harmonies with itself that no single human voice could produce. The canyon opened suddenly into a vast circular chamber, perhaps 300 feet across, with walls that soared up toward a circle of brilliant blue sky far overhead. Natural caves and passages honeycombed the walls at various levels, and from one of these elevated openings, the singing echoed with haunting clarity. But what dominated the chamber was the sight that waited at its center: a small lake of impossibly clear water, fed by a waterfall that cascaded from somewhere high above, and around its shores, the stolen cattle grazed peacefully alongside deer, elk, and other desert animals that should have been natural enemies. Standing waist-deep in the center of the lake was a woman, and Jake's rational mind struggled to process what his eyes reported. She stood at least 12 feet tall, with long black hair that floated around her like liquid obsidian and skin that seemed to glow with an inner light. Her features were unmistakably Apache, but refined and perfected beyond mortal beauty, as if she were the template from which all other women had been carved. She wore what appeared to be a dress woven from moonbeams and shadow, and when she turned toward Jake with eyes like deep pools of starlight, he felt his knees nearly buckle under the weight of her attention. "You have followed my trail, small warrior," she said, and her voice carried the same resonant quality as her singing, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Few possess such determination, or such disregard for their own safety. "Tell me, son of the eastern lands, what drives you to seek that which others flee?" Jake found his voice after several attempts, his throat suddenly dry as desert sand. "Those cattle belong to my employer, ma'am. I've been hired to bring them back." The giantess laughed, and the sound was like silver bells mixed with thunder. Your employer? You speak of Thomas Whitmore, the man who claims ownership of land that has belonged to my people since the world was young? The man whose cattle strip the desert of its grass and whose fences block the ancient paths of migration. The mention of Whitmore's name sent a shock through Jake that had nothing to do with the supernatural nature of his situation. How could this being, whatever she was, know about his employer? And more disturbing, how accurate were her accusations? Jake had worked for Whitmore for 3 years, but he'd never questioned the man's right to the vast acreage he claimed or considered the impact of his cattle operations on the native peoples of the region. I am Ayana, the giantess continued, moving through the water with impossible grace for someone of her size. Daughter of the mountain spirits, guardian of the old ways, voice of the voiceless earth. These animals came to me willingly, seeking refuge from a world that no longer has place for the wild and free. Your cattle baron would see every inch of this desert fenced and branded, every spring claimed for his exclusive use, every ancient path blocked by his ambition. As Ayana spoke, Jake began to notice details that his shock had initially obscured. The cattle weren't just grazing. They appeared healthier than he'd ever seen them, their coats glossy and their eyes bright with an alertness that domestic cattle rarely displayed. The deer and other wild animals moved among them without fear, and several young calves played alongside spotted fawns in a scene of harmony that seemed impossible in the natural world. You speak of my employer as if he were some kind of villain, Jake said, though even as the words left his mouth, he was remembering conversations he'd overheard, plans Whitmore had made to expand his operations into previously untouched areas of the desert. He's building something important here, bringing civilization to empty land. Empty. Ayana's voice carried a note of profound sadness. This land teems with life, small warrior, but only for those who know how to see. Every rock, every plant, every grain of sand is part of a web of connection that your people seem determined to destroy. Your Whitmore has already poisoned 3 springs with the runoff from his operations. He has fenced migration routes used by deer and antelope for thousands of years. His cattle have trampled sacred burial grounds and left the earth bare and bleeding. The accusations hit Jake with unexpected force because he recognized their truth. He'd seen the poisoned springs, though Whitmore had blamed them on natural mineral deposits. He'd helped string the fences that blocked traditional animal paths, though he'd been told it was necessary for proper land management. He'd watched the gradual transformation of the desert around the ranch headquarters from a diverse ecosystem to a barren expanse focused solely on cattle production. If what you're saying is true, Jake said slowly, then why take the cattle? Why not approach Whitmore directly with your concerns? Ayana laughed again, but this time the sound held no joy. Approach him? I am Apache, small warrior, and a woman besides. Your cattle baron would either dismiss me as a crazy Indian or attempt to have me captured for some traveling show. The taking of his cattle was meant as a message, a warning that the earth itself opposes his destructive plans. But I see now that he sent you instead of coming himself, which tells me he has learned nothing from my gentle persuasion. The word gentle struck Jake as particularly ironic, given the massive tracks he'd followed and the obvious display of supernatural power required to move 20 head of cattle across 50 miles of desert. But looking at the peaceful scene around the lake, at animals that should have been terrified living in harmony, he began to understand that Ayana's methods, while dramatic, had caused no actual harm to the stolen livestock. What happens now? Jake asked. I can't return without those cattle. Whitmore will have my job, and probably put a bounty on my head for failing to complete the contract. That is indeed a problem, Ayana agreed, moving closer to shore. As she did, Jake realized that her size seemed to fluctuate slightly, sometimes appearing merely very tall rather than genuinely gigantic, as if her physical form wasn't entirely fixed in the mortal realm. But perhaps it is also an opportunity. You have seen what your employer's activities are doing to the land. You have witnessed the harmony that is possible when greed does not drive every decision. The question is whether you have the courage to act on this knowledge. Jake felt the weight of choice settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Everything he'd believed about progress and civilization, about his role in the grand project of taming the American West, was being challenged by a supernatural being who spoke uncomfortable truths about the cost of that progress. The easy path would be to convince Ayanna to return the cattle, collect his pay from Whitmore, and pretend this encounter had never happened. But could he live with himself knowing what he now knew about the environmental destruction his employer was causing? "What kind of action are you talking about?" he asked finally. Ayanna smiled, and for a moment her otherworldly beauty was almost too intense to look upon directly. "Thomas Whitmore is not the only cattle baron with operations in this territory. He has rivals, men who would pay handsomely for information about his business practices, his water rights, his expansion plans. A trusted employee who decided to change sides could do considerable damage to his operations while helping more responsible ranchers succeed." The suggestion was clearly treasonous to his current employment, but Jake found himself considering it seriously. He'd seen enough of Whitmore's methods to know that the man was ruthlessly efficient and completely indifferent to any consequences that didn't affect his bottom line. Other ranchers in the territory practiced more sustainable methods, worked with rather than against the natural environment, and treated both their employees and their neighbors with greater respect. "And if I refuse?" Jake asked. "Then you are free to go," Ayanna said simply. "I will not force your choice, though I suspect your employer will be less understanding when you return empty-handed. But know this, small warrior, the earth itself is awakening to the damage being done to it. The spirits of this land are stirring from their long sleep, and they will not remain patient forever. Men like Thomas Whitmore are sowing seeds of a reckoning that will make the Apache Wars seem like a children's game." The prophecy in her words sent another chill through Jake, because he'd been hearing similar rumblings from other sources. The local Apache tribes, supposedly pacified years ago, were showing signs of renewed organization. Mexican revolutionaries were operating with increasing boldness on both sides of the border. Even among the white settlers, there was growing tension between the cattle barons and the smaller ranchers, farmers, and townspeople who felt squeezed out by big money interests. As if reading his thoughts, Ayanna continued, "The old ways and the new ways cannot coexist forever, Jake Morrison. One will triumph and one will fade into memory. The question is which future you choose to help create, one where the strong prey upon the weak without consequence, or one where all beings can thrive in harmony with the natural world." Jake stared at the peaceful scene around the lake, trying to imagine a world where such harmony could exist beyond this supernatural oasis. The idea seemed impossibly idealistic, yet the evidence was right before his eyes. Animals that should have been mortal enemies grazed side by side. Water flowed clean and clear despite the desert conditions, and even the air itself seemed somehow purer and more life-giving than the harsh atmosphere of the world outside. "How do I know you're telling the truth about Whitmore?" Jake asked. "How do I know this isn't some elaborate trick to turn me against my employer?" "You don't," Ayanna admitted readily. "Trust must be earned, not demanded. But I can offer you something your employer cannot, the truth about what his operations are really costing this land and its people. Are you brave enough to see it?" Before Jake could ask what she meant, Ayanna raised her hands above the water and began to sing in that hauntingly beautiful language he didn't recognize. The lake's surface began to shimmer and change, becoming reflective as a perfect mirror, and in its depths, images began to form with startling clarity. Jake saw the Rockingham Ranch as if viewed from high above, but this perspective revealed details that were invisible from ground level. The main operations were surrounded by a spreading zone of environmental damage that extended for miles in every direction. Streams that had once run clear were choked with silt and chemical runoff. Grasslands that had supported diverse plant communities for centuries were now barren earth broken only by scrub brush and invasive weeds. The few remaining water holes were fouled with cattle waste and algae blooms that killed fish and sickened wildlife. But the images went deeper than environmental damage. Jake saw Whitmore in his ranch house office, poring over maps with other wealthy men, planning the systematic acquisition of smaller ranches through foreclosure and intimidation. He witnessed meetings where bribes were paid to territorial officials to overlook health and safety violations. Most disturbing of all, he saw armed men being hired not for routine ranch security, but for what appeared to be military-style operations against neighboring properties. These events haven't happened yet, Ayanna explained as the visions continued to unfold. But they will if current patterns continue unchanged. Your employer is not content with the vast holdings he already possesses. He envisions an empire stretching from the Colorado River to the Rio Grande, with himself as its absolute ruler. The cost in human suffering and environmental destruction would be catastrophic. The final vision showed Jake himself, older and harder, leading a group of armed men in an attack on a small homestead where a family with young children was trying to defend their modest property rights. The image was so vivid and disturbing that Jake stepped back from the lake's edge, nearly stumbling over a rock in his haste to distance himself from the prophecy. "That won't happen," he said firmly. "I would never participate in something like that." "Not willingly, perhaps," Ayanna replied, and her voice carried infinite sadness. "But men can be changed by circumstances, worn down by compromises until they no longer recognize themselves. Each small moral compromise makes the next one easier, until even good men find themselves doing terrible things in service to terrible causes." The accuracy of that observation hit Jake hard, because he could trace his own moral decline over the past 3 years. When he'd first taken the job with Whitmore, he'd been proud to be part of building something important in the wilderness. But gradually, he'd been asked to do things that made him uncomfortable, intimidating homesteaders whose claims conflicted with Whitmore's interests, destroying evidence of environmental damage, keeping silent about illegal business practices. Each time, he told himself it was necessary for the greater good, that he was helping to bring order and prosperity to a lawless land. "So what's the alternative?" Jake asked. "If I turn against Whitmore, what's to stop me from just becoming a different kind of hired gun for whoever pays me next?" Ayanna stepped from the lake, water cascading from her otherworldly form without leaving her dress or hair even slightly damp. As she approached, Jake noticed that she had somehow returned to normal human proportions, though she retained the ethereal beauty that marked her as something beyond mortal nature. "The alternative is to choose your battles based on principle rather than profit," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder that somehow conveyed both tremendous strength and infinite gentleness. "There are people in this territory who are trying to build a different kind of future, one where prosperity doesn't require the destruction of everything wild and free. They need someone with your skills and knowledge, someone who understands both worlds and can help them succeed." As if summoned by her words, figures began to emerge from the various cave entrances around the chamber. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his pistol, then stopped as he recognized some of the faces. There was Maria Santos, whose family had been fighting Whitmore's attempts to claim their ancestral lands. Behind her came John Greyhorse, a mixed-blood Apache who'd been trying to establish a sustainable cattle operation that worked with, rather than against, the desert environment. Even more surprising was the presence of David Chun, a Chinese immigrant whose attempts to establish a farming community had been repeatedly sabotaged by Whitmore's operatives. "We have all suffered from Thomas Whitmore's vision of progress," Maria said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been fighting this battle far longer than Jake had been aware of it. "But separately, we are too weak to oppose him effectively. Together, with the right information and support, we might be able to stop him before his damage becomes irreversible." Jake looked around at the assembled group, realizing that he was witnessing the birth of something that could either be a powerful force for positive change or a dangerous insurgency that would bring even more violence to an already troubled region. The choice of which it became might depend largely on his own decision about whether to join them. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" he said. "Help us expose the truth about Whitmore's operations," John Greyhorse replied. "You have access to his private papers, his meeting notes, his correspondence with territorial officials. Evidence that could be used to bring legal action against him, or at least to warn his potential victims about what they're really facing. And if legal action doesn't work, then we consider other options," David Chun said grimly. "But we prefer to exhaust peaceful remedies before resorting to more direct methods." The implications were clear enough. If Jake joined this group, he would be committing himself to a course of action that could easily escalate into open conflict. The Arizona territory was still largely lawless, with territorial authorities often too corrupt or too distant to provide effective justice. When legal remedies failed, people frequently resorted to more primitive forms of dispute resolution. "I need time to think about this," Jake said finally. "Time is a luxury we may not have," Ayanna replied. "My sources suggest that Whitmore is planning something significant for the coming months, something that will make his previous activities seem restrained by comparison. If we wait too long, we may find ourselves trying to stop a flood rather than plugging a leak." Jake spent the next hour walking around the chamber, examining the ancient petroglyphs and trying to sort through the competing loyalties and moral imperatives that were tearing at his conscience. Everything he'd been taught about loyalty, about honoring contracts and obligations, argued for returning to Whitmore and reporting this encounter as a bizarre but ultimately irrelevant adventure. But everything he'd learned about right and wrong, about protecting the innocent and opposing injustice, pushed him toward joining Ayanna's unlikely coalition. The decision was made for him by a sound that echoed from the canyon entrance, the distinctive whistle that Whitmore's men used to signal each other during operations. Jake's blood ran cold as he realized that somehow, his employer had tracked him to this place. Whether through superior tracking skills or more supernatural means, Thomas Whitmore was approaching Ghost Canyon with what sounded like a substantial force of armed men. "He's coming," Jake announced to the group, who immediately began moving toward defensive positions around the chamber. "Whitmore and at least a dozen men, maybe more." Ayanna's expression hardened, and for a moment Jake caught a glimpse of the terrible power that lay beneath her benevolent exterior. "Then the time for choosing has passed. Will you stand with us, Jake Morrison? Or will you return to your employer and pretend this encounter never happened?" The moment of truth had arrived, and Jake discovered that when faced with an immediate choice between opposing sides, his decision was surprisingly easy. He'd seen too much, learned too much, to go back to blindly serving Thomas Whitmore's destructive ambitions. Whatever the consequences, he would cast his lot with those who were trying to preserve something worth saving rather than those who would destroy it for profit. "I'm with you," he said simply. The battle that followed was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. Whitmore's men entered the canyon with the confidence of those who held overwhelming advantages in numbers and firepower, but they hadn't expected to face an enemy who commanded powers beyond the natural world. Ayanna seemed to grow again as the conflict intensified, becoming a towering figure whose very presence caused horses to bolt and hardened gunfighters to flee in terror. The ancient spirits of the canyon awakened at her call, turning the very stones into weapons and the shadows into allies. But it was the human element of the fight that proved most decisive. Maria Santos and her people knew every inch of the canyon's hidden passages and defensive positions. John Greyhorse's Apache training made him nearly invisible as he moved between the scattered boulders and cave entrances. David Chen's experience with explosives, gained during his years working in mining camps, proved devastatingly effective against men who were used to intimidating unarmed farmers and homesteaders. Jake found himself fighting alongside people he'd been taught to consider enemies or inferiors, and discovering that they possessed courage, intelligence, and tactical skills that rivaled anything he'd learned in the regular army. The artificial divisions that had separated them in the outside world, white from Mexican, Apache from Chinese, rancher from farmer, seemed suddenly meaningless in the face of their shared commitment to defending something larger than their individual interests. The battle lasted less than an hour, but when it was over, Thomas Whitmore lay dead among the scattered rocks of the canyon floor, along with most of his hired gunmen. The survivors fled back toward the desert, carrying word that would transform Jake Morrison from trusted employee to wanted fugitive in a matter of days. There could be no going back to his old life now, even if he'd wanted to. "It's finished then," he said to Ayanna as they stood looking down at the carnage. "No, small warrior," she replied sadly. "This is only the beginning." Whitmore was just one man, but the forces he represented are much larger. There will be others who seek to follow his path, and they will be warned now about the resistance they face. The real struggle is yet to come. Jake nodded, understanding that he had committed himself to a war that might last for years or even decades. But as he looked around at his new allies, at the peaceful animals still grazing by the crystal lake, at the ancient symbols carved into stone by people who had loved this land long before any European had dreamed of conquering it, he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for longer than he cared to remember. The cattle were returned to their rightful owner, not Thomas Whitmore's estate, but to the land itself, where they would be part of a sustainable operation managed by people who understood the delicate balance between human needs and environmental preservation. Jake's old life as a hired gun for cattle barons was over, but his new life as a defender of the wild places and the people who depended on them was just beginning. As he rode out of Ghost Canyon beside his new companions, Jake Morrison looked back once at the towering figure of Ayanna standing beside her sacred lake. She raised one hand in farewell, and he thought he heard her voice carried on the desert wind, singing the same haunting song that had first drawn him to this place of transformation. The tracks he had followed in the desert had indeed belonged to an Apache giantess, but they had led him to something far more valuable than stolen cattle. They had led him to a truth about himself and his world that would guide his actions for the rest of his life, however long or short that might prove to be in the dangerous times ahead.